This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Can small telescopes take great astrophotos? If you've seen my channel before, you already know my answer. Of course they can. And these four I'm reviewing today are great little instruments for doing serious astrophotography. Of course, they aren't the right tool for every kind of astrophoto, but what they do well, they do very well. So in this video, I want to talk about what kinds of astrophotos small refractors like these really excel at taking. And then I'll jump into a full technical review of these four telescopes specifically. The Svbony SV545, the Sky Rover 66MA, the Touptek HOPE D60, and the Nakoh 60 GT. Let me begin by describing what I think happens with a lot of beginner deep sky astrophotographers. They get their first deep sky imaging rig. It may look like one of these right here. They take a picture of the Orion Nebula, the Andromeda Galaxy, the Pleiades. These all look great. They're the biggest, nicest, juiciest objects in the Messier catalog. But then they go back to that Messier catalog for another easy object, and they pick something like M1, the Crab Nebula, or M27, the Dumbbell, or M51, the Whirlpool Galaxy, and they're disappointed at how small these objects appear in frame. They think, hey, what's going on here? I spent all of this money on a nice astrophotography telescope, and it can't capture these beginner Messier objects very well. And in a sense, they're right. There's just so many deep sky objects that are bright, so they're easy enough to observe visually. So they go on beginners lists because they're easy at the eyepiece. But their apparent diameter is small. So a small telescope like one of these is never going to get a nice close-up picture of them with a lot of detail, even if you pair it with a small pixel camera. But if you're in this predicament, before you go out and get a bigger telescope, I'd encourage you to first get a much cheaper item, a dual narrowband filter, because you're going to be amazed at how many objects in the night sky this opens up with a small refractor. There are so many emission nebulae that are actually pretty accessible and huge in our night sky. It's really just about breaking out of the Messier catalog where there are only a few truly big objects like Andromeda size. But if you look through something like the Sharpless catalog of H2 regions, there's just so many amazing looking nebulae that will fill your field of view even with a small telescope. Of course, many of these big emission nebulae are challenging in that they're dim, but with modern filters and that improve contrast and modern software packages that make processing a lot easier, many of these really aren't that hard photographically. And you can check out my tutorial just last week where I show how easy it is to capture and process Hubble palette images with dual narrowband filters and color cameras. But let's say you aren't really into narrowband imaging. You want natural color, not false color imaging. Well, in that case, it gets a little bit more challenging with a small telescope. But if you're willing to take on that challenge, our galaxy is actually filled with interstellar dust. And this dust can be incredibly photographic, especially in certain constellations. In the northern hemisphere, the constellations Cepheus and Taurus are two favorites of mine for dusty regions of interstellar space. And while most of these dusty regions are along the main band of the Milky Way, there's also dust that we call IFN, Interstellar Flux Nebula, that is at high galactic latitudes. So even in galaxy season, we can go after something like the IFN. Some popular spots to capture IFN are around M81 and 82, or around the north or south celestial poles. And these clouds of dust are huge. You can frame them at basically any focal length and still not fully capture their extent, unless you go with like a wide angle camera lens. So getting the most out of a small scope is largely about strategy. It's figuring out the right objects to shoot with it and how to capture those objects. And as you advance in the hobby, if you stick with small telescopes, there's always a new challenge with the right filter and strategy. As an example, when I started in this hobby 10 years ago, one of the first scenes that I shot was this one of the Witchhead Nebula looking at the bright star Rigel in the constellation Orion. Now, 10 years later, I took basically the same photograph, basically the same framing, the same scene, and was able to tease out all kinds of new nebulosity, both in the dust and the HA emission, just through technique, knowing the right filters, and processing techniques, not by moving to some huge telescope. And this isn't some kind of cherry-picked area. There are hundreds and hundreds of deep sky regions that an astrophotographer with the right experience, skill, and creativity can capture well with small telescopes. What small refractors are not is a photographic jack of all trades. They're not going to produce a great photo of Jupiter or Saturn or the Ring Nebula or many objects in our night sky that have a small apparent diameter. You have to look for the big objects with these. So that's my spiel about small refractors. Now let's have a look at these 4 that I have here. And before I jump into my review, let me just disclose that all 4 of these were sent to me by their respective manufacturers. So Svbony, Sky Rover, Touptek, and Nakoh. And they have all agreed to my review policy, meaning none of these companies have any input into what I share. I also don't do paid reviews, so they're not paying me to review these telescopes. Everything that I'm sharing in this video is just reporting my personal experience from using these telescopes over the past few months. So let's start with a comparison chart I've made of specs. The SV545 is a bit of an outlier in this group of 4 with only 45mm aperture, while the others are closer together in aperture, around 60 to 66. However, once you put the 0.65x reducer on the Nakoh 60 GT, that does bring it down to 234mm focal length at f3.9, which I thought would make an interesting comparison to the Svbony, which is natively 203mm focal length at f4.5. There are some major differences in weight, something to keep in mind if planning to use these on something like this Star Adventure GTI mount. This mount has a listed capacity of 5 kilograms, but I try to keep the payload on it as light as possible for best performance. So now let's turn to physical characteristics like telescope features and build quality. So we'll start with the Svbony SV545. Okay, starting at the front here, it has a metal, fairly long lens hood. In terms of the front cap, it's this clip style, it's plastic. Sort of like what you'd get with a normal third-party camera lens. And basically the whole thing is metal, including all these pieces. We have the Vixen plate down here, a little extension, and then the ring, and then a top handle slash guide scope bracket up here at the top. And then the focusing is done right here. There's a little lock screw, and then this just moves just like a barrel focuser on a camera lens. Now, it comes with all the hardware so that if you want, you can install an electronic autofocus unit right here, and it comes with the belt and everything. So you just take this lock off, and then you put the belt around the focuser here, and you can get autofocus pretty simply. And then in the back here, we have a manual rotator with lock and very nice big markings to show you, how far you've rotated in any direction. So this is very nicely done. And then back here is just M48 threads. Next, we have the Sky Rover 66MA. Sky Rover is the house brand for Kunming United Optics, and this is similar to how Skywatcher is the house brand of Cinta or Askar is the house brand of Sharpstar. So these are 3 of the biggest telescope manufacturers in China. For us Americans, their official reseller and service center will be Astronomics, which is in Oklahoma. So the telescope they sent me to review is the 66MA. The MA stands for Multi-Purpose Astrograph. And this is an astrograph natively, meaning the field correcting elements are built into the telescope. But you can add a 0.8x reducer to change the focal length and ratio from 462 f7 to 370 5.6. Okay, starting at the front here, we have the standard metal felt-lined cap. And then we have also pretty standard a retractable dew shield that has this one locking knob and can retract or extend. On the inside, it looks to be painted with a matte black. And then in terms of the other mounting hardware, we have a nice black Vixen plate down here with some markings so that if you get your balance just right, you can get repeatable declination balance, which is a nice touch there. And then it has a little riser block there. And then it just has this one sort of thick ring. And then on the top of the ring, you have a handle, which also has some threaded M6 and 1/4" 20 screw holes for attaching things. In addition to having attachment points up here, this telescope also has a standard Cinta style finder shoe for attaching a guide scope or other accessory right there. Okay, the focuser is your standard sort of looks like maybe a 2.5 inch, a rack and pinion, double speed focuser with a lock at the bottom down here. It has a lot of focus travel, so it has about 80 millimeters of travel here. And then it has a nice manual rotator with lock back here. There's an indicator right there, and then the markings all along here. Okay, it does come with this photographic adapter stack. If you put this on and then you do about 55 millimeters from the back threads here, you'll be in good shape, but you can also take most of this off, reattach just like one of these parts and put the reducer in its place. And if you use the reducer, then you do have to get 55 millimeters from the back threads. Okay, so I would say in terms of mechanics, this is all fairly standard stuff, but it was all well done, easy to use, had no complaints. Oh, last thing I should mention, if you want to add an electronic autofocuser, you could take off this coarse knob, and there's a little flat piece down here with a screw hole for attaching your autofocuser bracket. The Rover 66MA includes a soft-sided carry case with basic foam inside with cutouts for the photographic adapters, the optional reducer, and there is a place in the foam for a removable piece if you want to add an electronic focuser to the telescope so that it will still fit. Next up, we have the Touptek HOPE D60. Touptek started out making mostly dedicated astronomy cameras, but now Touptek is expanding into other areas of astronomy and astrophotography. So they have their Stella Vita smart controller, and now this astrograph, as well as a line of guide scopes that can also function as astrophotography scopes if you use a small sensor like an IMX533 or smaller. And they did send me one of these new guide scopes as well. So far, I've only tested it as a guide scope, and it's great as a guide scope, I will say. I really like that they offer these with different focuser options. So I got the AR version, which is a rack and pinion style focuser, but they also have the AC version if you prefer a Crayford style focuser. But back to the HOPE D60, starting at the front. The front cap is a screw-on style, all metal. The dew shield is something I've never seen before. It retracts inside the telescope. So the front diameter of the whole scope doesn't change, but this whole piece just clicks out just like that to extend it. So I thought that was a pretty cool touch. You can see here that the color of this is sort of a silvery gunmetal gray. I think that it looks really good with the Warp Astron WD-20 mount. And then this has a nice thick ring. It has a bunch of extra little threaded holes on it for attaching more stuff. The handle has a nice little shape here for putting your hand under it so that your hand doesn't just sort of slip out. There's a little edge there. And then this fits a standard Cinta style finder device. You know, you could put your Stella Vita up here or your guide scope, but then it also has your standard finder shoe right down here. The focuser is your rack and pinion style. The focuser is a rack and pinion style focuser. When I was reaching focus, it was pretty close to being all the way in like this. And it only extends about maybe 3 centimeters, but for astrophotography purposes, that should be plenty. Remember, this is an astrograph. It's not really designed for visual. And then back here, we have the lock for manual rotation. This has markings all along. It's very nicely done. And finally, it ends with M48 threads. It does come with a back metal cap when you don't have a camera on it. All really nicely done. I've had no complaints. And if you're going to attach an electronic autofocuser, it has a guide online for attaching any kind of electronic autofocuser. It has all the different holes down here and the flat surface for attaching a bracket. You just take off this coarse knob. Touptek includes a soft-sided carry case that has premium foam inside, and the foam is cut in such a way that if you add an electronic focuser, it still fits in the case. Last but not least, we have the Nakoh 60 GT, and Nakoh is a new Japanese telescope company that reached out to me, and the 60 GT, along with the 1x flattener and the 0.65x reducer, is their full product lineup at the moment. This is the only telescope. They are working with resellers across the world, and in the United States, that reseller is Agena Astro. This telescope is a little different in design from the first three in that it is a premium triplet. So Like the Sky Rover 66MA, it does come with a visual back, and you can use it as a visual instrument. For photography, unless you're using a very small sensor, you're probably going to want to add either the 1x flattener or the 0.65x reducer flattener, which are both optional parts to get the most out of this telescope. Okay, starting in the front here, we have a standard felt-lined metal cap. And then we have the dew shield, which is fixed and it doesn't extend or retract. But the whole telescope is quite compact, so that's not a huge issue. This still is a very small, compact little telescope. But for how small it is, it's surprisingly heavy because there's a lot of solid metal pieces in the design here. Like it looks like this clamp for attaching the telescope to the Vixen plate is like solid metal. So it's and quite thick. I like that actually. It just makes it very secure. Okay, we have a standard Cinta style finder shoe there, but we also have a small handle up here which has some threaded M6 and M4 screw holes so you could attach more things up there. The focuser is a dual speed rack and pinion. It does have distance markings and it extends about 55 millimeters out. Okay, I currently have the reducer in there. The reducer actually goes right into the focuser, so most of the reducer is up here in the focuser. And when you reach focus with the reducer, you're pretty far in terms of focus. With the flattener, you're quite a bit further out, which is the standard way it works. And then here is our manual rotation. You just loosen that one and then you can manually rotate, and it has all the degree markings which are clearly labeled right there. Okay, if you want to use an electronic autofocuser, this coarse knob comes off right here, and the bottom of the focuser has a flat surface with threaded holes for attaching the bracket for your electronic autofocuser. Okay, my imaging tests were all done on one night, and to achieve that, I needed a very streamlined system, so I went with the ASI 2600 MC Air, because then I don't have to like move a guide scope or anything like that, because the guide camera chip is built into that camera. Now, the downside to the 2600 is it's APS-C, not full frame. So there's always sort of trade-offs here, but I figure most people using these telescopes are going to be using crop sensor, not full frame. So I went with that because it meant that I could do all of these tests in one night. I did them in my observatory on a Skywatcher EQ6R, which was mounted to a concrete pier. The guiding varied between around 0.4 to 0.6 arc seconds total RMS. And the objects that I picked for this test were M97 and M108. Now, this goes against my whole introduction about picking objects, because this is not particularly a good scene for a small telescope because both of these objects are really, really small. But the reason I picked this scene is for technical reasons. It's that this was high up in the sky for most of the night at this time of year. And so if I was doing this test in the late summer, I could have used a much better scene, like something in Cygnus or Cepheus. But for this time of year, there's not too many great scenes for small telescopes. We're in the middle of galaxy season, so I had to pick something, and this one seemed like a good sort of compromise scene, and it was very well positioned for my location so that I could shoot all of the 6 configurations in 5.5 hours. And for each configuration, I took 15 exposures at 3 minutes each, and then rejected the worst 3 to leave us with 12 exposures, 36 minutes total for each of these samples, and they were all calibrated with biased darks and flats. So the first thing we're going to look at is just each telescope and each configuration, and we'll make these full screen so you can really examine the full field and get a sense for the field of view with each of these telescopes. So starting with the Sky Rover, just with no reducer attached, just the default configuration, which is at f7. We get this. And this is just with an auto stretch applied after full calibration. At f5.6, we get this. So this is with the reducer now. And then now we're looking at the Nakoh with the 1x flattener. So this is at f6, 360 millimeter focal length. So a pretty similar field of view to the Sky Rover reduced. Okay, now we're looking at the Nakoh with its reducer. So this brings it down to 234 millimeter focal length at f3.9. So this is now what I'd consider a very wide field for deep sky. Okay, now we're looking at the Touptek HOPE D60, which is 280 millimeter focal length at f4.66. And finally, we're looking at the Svbony SV545, which is the widest at 203 millimeter focal length at f4.5. Okay, next, for each configuration, I ran on those auto-stretched full configurations with no processing other than the auto-stretch, the Abberation inspector, which has a look at star shapes across the field. We're mostly concerned at comparing, the center to the corners, and this is with the Sky Rover at f7. And we can zoom in a little bit to look at the center sharpness. Looks like that. And then we'll compare that to the corner. Looks pretty good. Maybe like slight softening in the corners, but barely noticeable. Okay, so that's at f7. Now let's compare that to f5.6. Here's at f5.6 with the reducer. I'm not really seeing much degradation in the image quality. Maybe, oh yeah, I think you can see just a little bit of elongation in that corner, but that might be, no, I don't think that's tilt because I'm seeing a little elongation sort of going inward in both corners. So just a little bit of wonkiness in the corners with the reducer, but not too bad. Okay, now here is the Nakoh at f6. Here's the center. There's a corner. We'll just look quickly at each corner. Looks pretty sharp to me. Okay, now here is with the aggressive reducer, the f3.9. And you can see it's definitely softer than the f6, but that's to be expected at f3.9. You're not going to get like really, really sharp stars, but this looks pretty good, I'd say, for f3.9. Nothing too out of whack. Okay, now here's the Touptek HOPE D60 at f4.66. Looks pretty similar to me to the one we just looked at. Maybe slightly sharper than the Nakoh at f3.9, but not quite as sharp at f6 is my guess. Okay, and then here's the Svbony. Definitely now we're seeing the stars look a little bit bigger. They almost look, like slightly out of focus, but I assure you that I did nail focus here. And strangely, I feel like this top corner looks the sharpest out of all of these. Even if I compare that to the center looks a little bit less in focus than the top corner, which is interesting. So there might be something here where with a field this large, depending on where you focus in the field, you get sort of slightly better or worse results. And there might be some kind of focusing strategy involved there. But I think, I tested this scope on not just this night, but different nights, and these results were pretty consistent. Okay, next I want to just look at if you went ahead and process these results just using sort of standard basic processing like deconvolution, stretching, noise reduction, saturation, what you can get with each telescope. So here's the Sky Rover at f7. You can see it's nice and sharp, very good contrast there on the Owl Nebula. Now at f5.6, you can see the signal to noise ratio improves, but it's not quite as contrasty as the more zoomed in view at f7. But the trade-off is if you're shooting something dim, which the Owl Nebula isn't. The Owl Nebula is a nice bright object, but if you're shooting something dim, like, you know, an emission nebula with a dual narrowband filter, the f5.6, you're going to get a bigger field of view and get, you know, more data that way faster. It's going to be a little bit brighter image. Okay, and then here is the Nakoh. That looks nice and sharp too. Maybe not quite as contrasty as the Sky Rover at f7, but we are starting to see a little bit of the extended shell of the Owl Nebula, even in just 36 minutes. And then here it is at f3.9, and again, you can see a bit of the extended shell, not quite as sharp, but you're trading sort of sharpness for speed and a bigger field of view. You can see this is a lot bigger than this one. So here's that bright star at 360 millimeter focal length. And then see here, it's like there, and you just get a lot more field of view, which is sort of cool in this case because I didn't intend to do this, but there's some neat little galaxies in this field of view. Like there's a cool little spiral galaxy down there. And then over here, I can't remember what this one is called, but that's a nice little galaxy too. Okay, here's the Touptek HOPE D60. And then finally, here's the Svbony SV545. Okay, and then my last technical test is I've registered these all to the same reference, which was this most zoomed in one, the Sky Rover f7. And then I've applied way more saturation than I would normally do. But I feel that this like ultra saturated looks will sometimes reveal some interesting things about these telescopes. Now, keep in mind, again, this is not how much saturation I would suggest in any kind of real world processing, but I think that it's nice because it shows differences better than any of the other tests that I've shown so far, where you might be just thinking, okay, these telescopes are all great, but all you've changed is field of view. This is maybe going to reveal more why there's such a big price discrepancy, and something like the Nakoh is quite a bit more than anything else. Okay, so on the left here, we have the Sky Rover at f7. In the middle, the Sky Rover at f5.6. And then on the right, we have the Nakoh at f6. Okay, so let me zoom in here. Let's start with this little galaxy down here at the bottom. And again, I think that this sort of shows what we saw before with the Owl Nebula, in that the Sky Rover at f7 is a very nice contrasty scope. At f5.6, you're trading sort of that contrast and sharpness a little bit for a slightly better signal to noise ratio. And then the Nakoh at f6, interestingly, is showing the most sort of color variation in the galaxy, but it's probably also the softest of these three. I'm not sure. It looks like there's a little bit less local contrast there. Now, if we look at just sort of this random star field, I would say all of these look pretty good. But when we get up to this bright star, which is a blue star, I think this is pretty interesting. So under extreme amounts of saturation, you can see the halo looks pretty blue and pretty good. under with the Sky Rover at f7, although we're seeing a little bit of this sort of yellowish green on just one side of the star. But then at f5.6, we're seeing that yellow ring and then a green ring all throughout the star. Well, with the Nakoh at f6, it retains just its beautiful blue color. So I think that has to do a lot with the glass types being used. And when I've done this saturation test before, if a telescope is using very high-end glass like FPL 53, like the Skywatcher Esprits, they retain this blue color in nice blue stars all the way up. You can just keep saturating them, and the halo still looks good. While other scopes start to sort of fall apart under extreme amounts of saturation. Okay, and then finally, here's the Owl Nebula. Here, I would say the Sky Rover and the Nakoh are pretty evenly matched, while the Sky Rover at f7 is again just showing the sharpest sort of vision of that. So for bright objects like the Owl Nebula or maybe galaxies, I think the Sky Rover at f7, of course, is a more zoomed in focal length. It's the biggest aperture, so that's going to give you the most detail. But that's not necessarily why you would buy a small scope. It's up to you, and I think that something that I like about these reviews is showing that even within small scopes, you can get some variation, and in what your imaging goals might be. Okay, and now we have 3 more telescopes to look at here, or 3 configurations with the extreme color test. So on the left, we have the Nakoh at f3.9 with the reducer. In the middle, we have the Touptek HOPE D60. And on the right, we have the Svbony SV545. Okay, and then so looking at M108, obviously the Touptek HOPE D60 is showing the most sharpness here. But considering this is f4.66, let me bring back up the Nakoh at f6. Yeah, because I'm like, that's a nice amount of sharpness at f4.66. So that's pretty impressive if we compare to this one at f6. The Svbony is looking a little bit soft compared to these other 2. But keep in mind, this is a $500 scope, and this one's $950, and this one is $1,000 plus. So this one's $1,400 in this configuration, so almost 3 times as much. Looking at this bright blue star, again, the Nakoh is doing an impressive job, even with the reducer. That looks like brilliantly blue with no sort of false color. Now, interestingly here, the Svbony is, other than the Nakoh, is my second most preferred scope in terms of getting this blue star correct. Like, that's a really nice blue halo. Now, if we really zoom in, you can see right along the bright edge of the core, it's showing a little bit of a magenta fringing. While the Touptek is going in the other direction. It's like a green fringing. So these are the sort of the 2 sides of chromatic aberration. You're either going to the green or to the magenta. And so the Svbony is going towards the magenta, the Touptek's going towards the green, and the Nakoh is well corrected, where it's not showing any false color on that blue star. Okay, and then here is the Owl Nebula, and you can see the Svbony is quite a bit softer. We're sort of missing that 3rd star. But again, if you weren't really going after these tiny details so much as just trying to get the massive field of view with Svbony, that might not matter so much. But in terms of color, I'm actually pretty impressed with where the Svbony ended up. The Touptek is looking pretty good too overall, but I think is more similar in how it's doing color correction to the Sky Rover, where it's like it's bringing out these sort of greens in terms of the chromatic aberration, but at a normal level of saturation, that star would still appear mostly bluish because you would be getting more of that sort of extended halo. It's not till we like really saturate the problems with the color that we see that kind of green. But it's just interesting to me, there is something to this very good glass that they're putting in the Nakoh that we're not quite seeing in the others. But to wrap up this sort of technical analysis, all of these scopes did very well. I mean, and so to a large extent, I think you're going to be paying for what field of view you want, what features you want. Hopefully I've given you sort of a range of options here. None of these are bad options. It's all just sort of picking the right scope for the job. And I hope through these technical comparisons, they give you a better idea of what to expect. After you get one of these small telescopes and start producing great images with it, what do you actually do with the photos? Well, I would suggest starting your own website to display your photos like I have at nakohcarver.com. And today's sponsor, Squarespace, makes that incredibly easy. You can purchase your domain name and hosting all in one place, and Squarespace includes professional templates for your website that are intuitive and easy to customize due to Squarespace's design system, which is called Squarespace Blueprint. Everything that you need for your website is included, from a spam-free contact form to selling tools built in. And if you do want to sell a service or a product through your website, customers can pay however is most convenient to them, whether it's credit card, PayPal, or Afterpay. So if you need a professional website, check out squarespace.com/nebulaphotos for your free trial. And if you're ready to make a purchase, you can get 10% off your first purchase of domain or hosting with the code nebulaphotos at checkout. Since this video is over 20 minutes long, you're now seeing the names of everyone who supports this channel on patreon.com/nebulaphotos. Patreon members get a bunch of exclusive benefits, like a monthly bonus video, and then of course the growing backlog of past bonus videos, which is up to 15 at this point. Everyone also gets one-on-one messaging support with me, additional channels on my Discord server, the monthly imaging challenge, a monthly Zoom call with the whole Patreon community. And if you are going to NEAF in a few days, we're also going to be doing an in-person Nebula Photos meetup on Saturday, April 11th. So all of this starts at just $1 per month, and I think it would be well worth checking out if you appreciate what I'm offering on this YouTube channel. As always, this has been Nakoh Carver. Clear skies.